How can there be any meaningful interplay between science and religion? It is said that the universe was written in the language of mathematics, yet the Bible is a mere collection of words. Let's say that you are at home and you make a decision to have a pot of coffee. You put the water in, you put the grounds in, or you grind them yourself, depending on if you have a grinder or not. You put it in your coffee maker, or you put it in your French press, you put the appropriate amount of water in, and you let it brew, and then you have a pot of coffee. There are some distinct questions we could be asking about what exactly is going on in this situation. But there are some ways of describing the situation that are fundamentally different, and yet are also concerned with the same sort of truth. For example, if I were to say, why is the coffee hot? You could give a purely scientific answer to this. Well, the hot plate underneath and likewise the water inside were brought to near boiling temperatures. They were steeped over the coffee, falling into the carafe, and therefore creates a significantly hot carafe that you don't want to touch with your hands. That's why the coffee is hot. Or more specifically, that is what caused the coffee to be hot. However, if I were to ask, why did you make a cup of coffee, or why did you make a pot of coffee? The answer could be, I'm making a pot of coffee because I'm having people come over. You see, one of them can be explained by a mathematical fact. The other can be explained by another set of facts, which is that I have someone coming to my house. Both of these sort of explanations are part of the whole. One and the other can be true at the same time. The pot of coffee can agree to the mathematics of the world. It obeys the laws of nature, so to speak. But also, the pot of coffee has a meaning outside of merely the what is going on. What is going on with the coffee has to be mediated through the why is the coffee. And as we mentioned last week, Polkinghorne begins by talking about science and faith, the Bible and the STEM sciences, in the language of truth that is expressed in different sort of ways. One cannot say that it is unnecessary to know the why the coffee is being made. We can describe the what's, but then if there is no explanation for the what's, then we lose the meaning of the making of the coffee in the first place. Every fact that we can describe, whether it be mathematics or whether it be humanities, is an interpreted fact. It is interpreted through an actor or interpreted through an agent. And this is one of the things that is so important when it says, why does science have something to say to faith, and why does faith have something to say to science? It's because both of these realities are dealing with the question of truth. But both of these methods are ways of reaching towards a holistic truth. Now, one of the things that is implicit in this question is, what does science have to do with faith, or what does faith have to do with science? Is a perceived understanding that these two realities are in competition with each other. And not just in competition as to which one is more important, but as to which one has any meaning whatsoever. And as Polkinghorne, himself a longtime physicist, says, this is a false dichotomy. This is a false dichotomy that can be explained and demonstrated by actually the history of some of our interpreted facts. Again, there is an avenue in which, or at least a presumption of which, well, science is objective and faith is subjective, or science is objective and the humanities are simply subjective. Actually, when you look at the scientific method, there are always interpretations of the what's of the world, and those interpretations are always leaps of faith in some way, shape, or form. A really good example of this is when we are beginning to understand more of the universe, or the way that the universe is working and functioning in the latter 1800s and early 1900s, there was a popularly held belief called the steady state hypothesis of the universe. That the universe was simply static. There was no movement in the universe. It simply always was there, and therefore, in the interpreted fact, was an eternal universe. It's always existed. And part of the reason why this was attractive was because one of the things that faith says in the Christian tradition is that there was a beginning of creation. If the universe was a steady state, there would be no necessary beginning, and likewise be no necessitated beginner. In other words, if we take Thomas Aquinas' famous syllogism of God as the prime mover, God is the first mover of something, then if we have no beginning, then there is no beginner. There is no origin or author. However, the truth of the matter is that as we have done several different observations, such as the observation of the redshift, the ways in which the stars and the celestial bodies actually give us a particular shift of red light that tells us they are actually moving away from us, we have come to the very good conclusion that the universe is actually expanding. And because the universe is expanding, there is, by necessity, a starting point for where this happens. And by the way, the starting point of where that happens was proposed by none other than a Roman Catholic. And in fact, the Big Bang was in fact language that this Roman Catholic gave to describe the movement of the universe. So, interestingly enough, one of the people who was a big proponent of the fact that the universe had a beginning, even if it was significantly longer than we might have first thought about it, was none other than someone who was of faith. It wasn't someone who was simply against faith. And likewise, those who were of faith have been deeply supportive of various sciences. In fact, Charles Kingsley, an Anglican priest himself, was a big proponent of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, because it didn't simply get rid of human morality, it didn't simply get rid of this differentiation between humans and animals. And again, Polkinghorn's going to talk about later how that is a complete misconception of what Darwin was saying. But what Kingsley said is that this actually is supportive of the Genesis account because everything that God made has value. And everything that God made has value intrinsically, not simply what humans assign value to it. It's actually a very interesting theological move that Kingsley makes there. But the implicit understanding of the question is that why do these things have anything to do with each other? Well, it's because they actually are reaches towards an objectivity that neither one of either the scientific method nor of faith itself has complete and total access to. We instead have a holistic point of view in which both of these are saying something not just to each other, but also to us as a whole about the universe. And hence why the whole dialogue between faith and science is so important, because they are meant to go together. They're not meant to be kept separate. They are approaches to the capital T truth of the world, and therefore worthy of dialogue between themselves. If we admit that our thoughts are dependent on the neural substrate, then how can we possibly say that they determine what we ultimately do? Throughout the history of the Western thought, there has been a dichotomy, sometimes proposed, between the non-physical spirit and the physical reality of the world. There is a bifurcation between those intangible things and those tangible things. And science, especially within the 1700s and 1800s, proposed a largely and purely mechanical way of understanding the universe. In other words, there was no non-observable thing that the universe was made up of. Anything that was non-observable was simply non-existent, or was constructed to believe that they existed. There's no non-physical matter of the world. That is a proposal that is alive and well today. However, it is fighting you might be surprised to hear this, an uphill battle, even in atheistic circles. There's a famous thought experiment proposed that has to do with whether intelligence or consciousness is able to be purely mechanically described. And this was something put forward in a famous thought experiment by John Searle, who, by the way, is an atheist, in which John Searle, in what's called the Chinese room experiment, is talking about the translation of language, in that you're feeding a computer language that you need to translate into something else. And you're feeding it a certain array of characters in the Mandarin Chinese language, and it's spitting out a correct interpretation on the other side. And it's getting to where basically you program the computer to actually have a conversation with you. But Searle is trying to illustrate that, in fact, what we're doing is not artificial intelligence. It, in fact, is only a syntax exchange. In other words, syntax is the mechanical observation of what a word means to what a word's supposed to mean in another language. It's simply a syntax exchange. There's no, what he would say, semantics going on. There's not a thought process within this computer, even though it has every observable look of having a conversation with a particular person. Rather, what Searle is saying is that consciousness is something that is real. It's something that is a real part of our intelligence, but is not physical. And therefore, as it comes to the description of the universe as purely physical, is actually beginning to see some fewer and fewer people holding to this concept. Rather, we are actually recognizing something that our very, very early Jewish ancestors understood, which is that there is no dividing the human being into the spiritual and the physical, or into the conscious and the mere body. There's no soul and body bifurcation, but rather we are ensouled or embodied souls. And as in fact has been pointed out by neuroscientists, there is the problem of consciousness, which is that even though we can describe all kinds of things about human consciousness from a physical perspective, such as neurons firing, such as electric pulses being put forward, such as brain mapping and things like that, that are reliable, I should say, the one thing is that it is a fundamentally unpredictable science. And it might sound strange for me to say unpredictable science, but what has been shown, even in quantum mathematics, that there is an unpredictability of the universe built into the actual structure. And we're discovering that more and more as a more reliable way of seeing the universe than simply as purely mechanical. Rather, there's something far, far deeper going on in this. And dare we say, far more designed going on. Why can we say something about the physical and spiritual aspects of the universe? Well, in fact, both science and faith have told us there's more to the universe than just the physical. And science itself is moving in the direction there is more than simply the observable. That there is more to the world than simply the things that we can measure. And therefore, it requires, again, an interpreted set of facts. How are we interpreting what the physical phenomenon is telling us through perhaps a little bit more nuanced and a little bit wider point of view than simply the physical versus the non-physical? Do you believe that God has made the evidence for his existence self-evident? If God is self-evident, what do you think are the most compelling self-evident arguments for his existence? Polkinghorne is going to reflect largely where the 20th century and likewise the early 21st century has come as it comes to the theology of apologetics. Apologetics is simply a study of both theology, biblical studies, but also of philosophy that has to do with how can we say that belief in God is viable? How can we say that belief in God is in fact true? Polkinghorne is going to take a much more modest approach. And he's going to say that, number one, his argument is there's no knockdown syllogism that's going to be one of those things that, oh, I am an irrational person for not believing in God. As much as we of the faith might want to believe that, thinkers such as John Polkinghorne and also other Anglican thinkers of the 20th century, including one of the most important theological thinkers of the 20th century, Austin Farrer, would say that there's not a syllogism that we work out. However, there is a more nuanced and perhaps a more powerful way of arguing this. Polkinghorne wants to give you 3 reasons why we can believe that there is really, really good evidence for God. And it has to do with something way more fundamental than just the math. It has to do with, why does the math work in the first place? Here's the first argument he puts forward, the argument of intelligibility. Why can I say that 2 + 2 = 4 at all? Why can I accurately predict what the weather is going to do in the next hour? How can I accurately say how much gas it's going to take me to make it home on a regular basis? Well, there is an intelligibility about the world we live in which we are able to use our rationality to understand the world. In other words, the world is not random. The world has a deep logic to it that is, in fact, intelligible by us, and also is able to be discerned and accurately used for various means and purposes. It's not as if 2 + 2 = 4 one day and maybe it'll equal something different tomorrow. There's not a chaotic randomness to the order in which the universe is constructed, but rather there is a baked-in intelligibility. And this is why this particular move is very important. If there is an intelligibility to the universe, why is it there? The explanation of the universe as arising randomly has, as Polkinghorne and others would say, far less explanatory power in this particular sense. Explanatory power, by the way, is the likelihood that a particular premise is true. There is much less explanatory power in saying that randomly the universe arranged itself logically. There's a lot less explanatory power in that than to say that the universe was ordered on purpose. Now, that purpose might not be God, but that purpose is most certainly an outside force, or an outside being of some sort, an outside intelligence, so to speak, whether that be supercomputer or whether that be God. There is something outside the universe that has arranged the stuff as it is, therefore making something intelligible. Or another way to say this is that the universe is constructed after the likeness of an intelligence. The universe is able to be made sense of because there is a pattern after something else that makes sense. So the thing is that there is an intelligibility to the universe that is perhaps not explained as well if we don't have an outside intelligence. But there's another particular one that comes up, the argument for the fine-tuning of the universe. There is an extremely specific set of circumstances that caused life on Earth to arise. And even if you don't take the evolutionary or the biological evolutionary perspective on this, at least try the hat on. In the arising of life, in the ways in which evolutionary biologists will tell us, it's that it arises out of some extremely specific circumstances. There is an extremely specific circumstance that had to be met in order for life to arise as it is, and most certainly for intelligent life to arise as it is. Scientists who look at this don't see a randomness in this. They see, in other words, a particular set of circumstances that had to have just occurred in order for this to happen. And in order for that to occur, not only for it to arise, but for it to be sustainable and for it to actually be logical, implies that there is, at least in some ways, a significantly low chance of explanatory power that the world arose randomly. We perhaps can observe all kinds of places that are inhospitable in and of itself to life as a whole, or at least at one point it was. So go ahead and look at the current studies being done into the Mars atmosphere. But one of the things that is true, at least about the ways in which we're kind of couching this right now, is that life on Earth is sustained by and exists because of an extremely specific set of circumstances. And we're talking about minute to the degree that if the Earth was in any, even like minuscule amounts of different positions to the sun, life would never have, it would not be sustainable. So is there perhaps a probabilistic reason as to why those things occur? There's another thing. Perhaps there is an intelligence beyond what we simply see in the physical universe. But not even talking about the mathematics here. Remember about the idea of the consciousness of the mind? How can we say that there is an action that is good or an action that is bad? How can we universally on the human level understand murder as evil and living as good? There are some universal things that we hold as humans, just in the barest sense, that give us a moral understanding of humanity and likewise our relationship with the rest of the world. We have a moral reasoning. Where did that come from? Is that explained merely by altruism that helps us continue on our genes? That is, in fact, not as descriptively appropriate as thinking that, in fact, there was an intelligence that organizes the moral center of the human being. And likewise, again, you see where this is kind of going, right? The imprint on the world as being a morally charged world, not merely a random world in which things just happen and we just don't care, but rather something in which we deeply have a moral sense that there is justice and injustice, that there is good and bad, that there are things that are better or worse. We can make those judgments not merely based upon the physical phenomena of the universe, but based upon a moral center of gravity. And that moral center of gravity is not determinate based upon our physiology, but rather it's based upon the mystery of consciousness. And because it's based on the mystery of consciousness, of which Polkinghorne himself says, we don't know if we'll ever explain this. Because it's in the mystery of the consciousness of the human being, that itself lends to where does the consciousness arise from? And why is the consciousness tuned, so to speak, to the moral center? So, is this evidence for an intelligence outside of the mere physical universe, outside of it merely being random? So, you'll see he's putting this forward as three particular arguments. The argument that the world is intelligible. Why is it intelligible? The argument that the world is in fact fine-tuned. The universe is made seemingly by an architect of some sort, or at least an architectural intelligence. And likewise, the moral center. Why do we, particularly as humans, have moral centers to us? Why do we have the ability to make moral decisions? Three particular arguments that he wants to put out as good, solid ways of thinking about evidence beyond simply the randomness of the universe towards an architect, perhaps. Does God act directly through evolution or simply conceive the process and allow it to happen? Was God aware that it would culminate in human beings? This is a gigantic point of contention between faith and science. Is evolutionary biology? And part of the reason why this is so important to kind of get is not only because we live in the aftermath here in the United States, and likewise still in the aftermath of the belief that evolutionary biology was completely opposed to religiosity, something that we've already talked about several times as simply not being the historical case. But one of the other things that is under the surface of this question is a significant point of clarification that needs to happen that we're still working out the aspects of. If God acts in the world, how would God act if there was an evolutionary cycle in which humanity arises from? To think about God as the creator in Genesis chapter 1 is, in one way, to have a nice, straight-away way of describing the creation of the world, and also to be able to have a way of explaining within the context of that creation what humanity's role within it is. Humanity is after the image and likeness of God. Humanity shares a mysterious likeness with her creator. And so we are endowed with a certain spirituality that is not merely a happenstance thing, but is an intentional thing by God. And the thing is that there's a lot, and historically, Christians have held on to those stories as being significantly explanatory about who humanity is, and not merely what humanity is. We are not simply random beings. We are beings that have a createdness to them. But to say that evolution does not allow for this is, once again, to, I think, make a factual a priori assumption, a prior assumption about what evolution is trying to say. Again, evolutionary biology, whether it is by the lens of one who is of faith or who is not of faith, are always interpreted facts. They have a lot to do with how our cosmology functions, what we believe about the universe already, and therefore it is interpreted through the medium of what we believe. And we can believe true things. So the thing is that belief versus science, that is not only a false dichotomy, that is a confusion of categories. In order to have science, you have to have some sort of established method and belief that goes behind it. Science doesn't operate in a vacuum. And likewise, we as humans don't operate in a vacuum. But I digress. The question is, can God act through evolution? Here's the way that Polkinghorne wants to couch this. The way that we can think about this a little bit more nuanced is that instead of thinking that God bakes the cake and it comes out already in the ways in which the forms are already established, what if it is that God endows the universe with what he likes to call a great potentiality? There is a potentiality that is baked into the universe such that there arises out of it creativity. There is, in fact, a creativeness that is not simply a random sort of things pop out and maybe it works sometimes, but rather there is a methodical creativeness in which there is an arrangement, association, a changing, a moving, a dynamicism between the world and the world as it is being made. And so he wants to say that rather than thinking about, did God create this way or this way, he says, let's get rid of these distinctions. Rather, how are we seeing the way that the world functions? Whenever we have infectious diseases that have life cycles that last every 10 days or so, and we can see entire life cycles of strains, of families, of things, and we can see this on a sort of microscopic level, we can see that there are ways in which life in the universe adjusts itself based upon its own sort of logic. Again, there is a logic to the way that the world functions. And one of the ways that scientists have, for the past 100 or more years, described this is in the growing evidence of the theory of evolutionary biology. And in the macro sense, what we're asking ourselves is, there is an arising, at least it seems, intelligibility, and likewise an arising understanding of the creativity of life. A potentiality that it has in and of itself to, as Polkinghorne would say, self-make. And again, he's going to explain this a little more carefully, I think, in later chapters, but what he's trying to say is God works through the universe. And the way that we interpret how God works through the universe can be on bigger and smaller levels. And it can include both miracle and natural phenomena. And so there's not a disallowance between these two things. Again, this is going back to that bifurcation that often is the case between the miraculous and the physical. For Polkinghorne, that doesn't exist. Rather, it is both of these things are attaining to the truth of the matter, and the ways in which, whether biology or whether by other means, this is how God is giving rise to the creativity that is baked into the universe. And again, the reason why this is important to note is that this is a significantly nuanced position that not everyone's going to agree with. I don't think Polkinghorne cares about that. Rather, what we're trying to say is how can we intelligibly describe the universe both by the ways that science has proven itself to be reliable and the ways in which faith also is trying to say similar things? How can we have a synthesis between what we know both by our intelligence of the exterior possibilities of the universe through our physical sciences, and also through the consciousness in which we are endowed with this far more mysterious thing of consciousness? There is a way in which these two things can reconcile, and Polkinghorne wants to say this is a really good area for that to be thought about. Was the tsunami an act of God? As Polkinghorne notes, this is perhaps the most difficult question to answer from theism itself. In fact, we're having a Sunday school right now over the problem of evil, which is what this question is bringing up. In a world in which there is unexplainable or meaningless evil, such as the tsunami that is mentioned in this chapter, the Indonesian tsunami that had massive casualties, or we can simply fill in the blank with what's the most recent natural disaster we can think about. Hurricane Katrina comes to mind. The hurricane that struck Houston a couple years ago. There are many other natural disasters that we can think about that we can say, did God allow this to happen? Or was this God's will? This is a significantly complicated question, and one in which is going to need a much more careful treatment in one of the later chapters. But suffice to say, Polkinghorne wants to say, there is a difference between saying that God actively wills an evil and that God permits something to happen. This is something that philosophers will often say is the difference between God's active will and permissive will. God actively wills some things and permissively wills others because of a fundamental conviction that God does not will nor create evil. God is an altruistic God. God desires the life of his creation. And likewise, when we say that, we also cannot categorically say that God wills evil upon the universe, because God, in the actively committing evil acts, all of a sudden throws a category problem on God's own self. Are we saying that God's a good God or an evil God? If God is perfectly good, God cannot be evil, can he? So that's what this question is asking, and it's a significantly hard question. What Polkinghorne would like to say about this is that while God does not actively will for evil to happen, God, in his permissive will, allows certain things to happen that good might be brought about by it. In the same sort of way that surgery is, we could say, a destructive thing simply from the physical aspects of it. You are cutting someone open to then cut organs and tissue and bone and things like that, but in the ultimate hope and the ultimate expectation that healing will occur in the long-term sense. It's sort of like saying, whenever you have a compound fracture of a bone, and you have to set that bone by putting screws and metal plates and casting around the hand, it absolutely causes destruction at first because you're moving stuff around, you're sometimes breaking a bone again to reset something, you're breaking the skin, you're tearing muscle, you're immobilizing your hand. There's a lot of destructive things that happen in that process, but all of that is meant for the long-term healing of the member. And again, it might be sometimes trite to say that in the light of personal tragedy. It's perhaps something far too simple to say, well, God allowed this to happen for your good. There is a longer term sort of way of talking about that in which we simply don't have the logical or even the foresight to be able to even comprehend what exactly is going on in that circumstance. By faith, we walk in the ways that perhaps the New Testament would say that God brings about all things for the good of those who love him. We can affirm that. But To say that there's a simple explanation for evil in the universe is, I think, to not take evil seriously. But also to say that there's no explanation for evil in the universe, I think, is to take God too lightly. There is an aspect of exchange between these two things. And this significantly difficult question perhaps requires a bit more personal treatment than simply a quick couple of paragraph answer. But all to say is that what Polkinghorne would like to consider, like other philosophers and Christian thinkers, is that there's a significant difference between saying that God actively wills an evil versus God permitting an evil such that good might be brought in the long term. Whether we can see that long term is certainly up for debate, but that's at least one explanatory fashion of explaining meaningless evil in the world.